Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Worcester Regional Research Bureau's forum this morning entitled Balancing the FY09 Budget, Rolling the Dice with Your Tax Dollars. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the president of the Research Bureau. Today's program is part of the Francis A. Harrington Forums. We'd like to express our gratitude to the Beechwood Hotel for hosting today's program. It's always a pleasure to have an event here and to bring the greetings of the hotel. Mark Waxler, he's the general manager of the Beechwood and also a member of the Research Bureau Board. Mark?
Roberta, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Beechwood. And as you walk around and look at some of the exciting things that we have is the original lithographs outside, the stained glass that is in the staircase as you're going back up, and that's from the earthquake in San Francisco. Survived the earthquake. We found it about a dozen years ago. And back there, I know the doors are closed, but we have the original chapel from Worcester City Hospital. As you get making plans to go to Hanover Theater, we'd be more than happy to have you come here and have dinner or cocktails afterwards. So welcome. It's nice to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'd also like to thank Mark Crandall, who's the president of TD Bank North. They're providing the financial support for today's forum. The Research Bureau also wishes to express its appreciation to Bank of America for providing support for this series, Telegram and Gazette for advertising it, the City of Worcester Government Channel under the direction of Judy Warren for videotaping it. This event will be rebroadcast on Worcester's government channel and also on a number of other of our town channels. And check your local listing for times and dates. And we also, of course, want to thank our many corporate sponsors who support us during the year, many of whom are here today. I'd like to mention, before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of events that the Research Bureau will be presenting. On April 10th, we're going to be hosting a forum on the challenges facing the next superintendent of the Worcester Public Schools. It will be held at Worcester State College, and it will be moderated by the former Commissioner of Education, David Driscoll. On June 9th is the date of our 23rd annual meeting, which will be at noon at Mechanics Hall. Our speaker this year is going to be John Rowe, the president and CEO of Exelon Corporation, one of the nation's largest utilities in the country. And for some of you may remember that name. John was the head of New England Electric Systems until about a decade ago, now National Grid. So he will be returning here, and they're doing some very interesting things in terms of green energy and so on. And for more information about the event or to learn about sponsorship opportunities, please contact the Research Bureau office. And be sure to visit our website, www.wrrb.org, to download our reports and to find out about upcoming events. And if you would like to receive our email updates, please leave your business card at the information table outside or email us. It's now my pleasure to introduce Brian Buckley, who is going to moderate today's program. Brian wears two very important hats in the Worcester community. He's a director of the law firm of Fletcher, Tilton & Whipple, and he serves as the chairman of the Research Bureau Board of Directors. And today he will serve as the moderator and introduce our distinguished panel. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Roberta, and welcome. Nearly 15 years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote the seminal article, Defining Deviancy Down, which lamented the loss of old standards and the elasticity of what is now considered acceptable. At one time, the gambling industry had a subcultural vernacular few outsiders cared to use. Their terms are now our metaphors. Political reporters regularly write about handicapping a race and winner-takes-all primaries. They describe a well-financed candidate as having a big bankroll. They expose strategies that raise the stakes or analyze the folding of an unsuccessful strategy. We at the Research Bureau are nothing if not au courant and have adopted as our own the fashionable application of gambling terms, hence the title of our program, Balancing the Fiscal Year 09 Budget, Rolling the Dice with Your Tax Dollars. We are delighted to have with us three talented, devoted public servants whom I will introduce to you and then ask them to speak in the order of their introduction. The first is Secretary of the Executive Office for Administration and Finance, Leslie A. Kerwin. Ms. Kerwin joins the Patrick Murray administration as Secretary of Administration and Finance with over 23 years of leadership and impact in state, local, and transportation finance. She is recognized for partnering with cities and towns in solving difficult municipal finance problems and for her experience in a wide range of Commonwealth policy and management responsibilities. In her most recent job as Chief Financial Officer at the Massport Authority, Leslie led the most significant financial recovery among U.S. airports in response to 9/11. Her work with cities and towns received recognition, including 2 awards from the Massachusetts Municipal Association. She holds a degree from Harvard-Radcliffe and a Master of Public Policy degree from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She lives in Arlington with her husband and 2 teenage sons. Welcome. Our second speaker is well known to the denizens of the city of Worcester. The Telegram and Gazette reported this week, there are some who want to revisit the charter, a charter which gave us the leadership of the legendary city manager, Francis McGrath, a wise visionary who led Worcester nobly and well for several decades. Many felt we would never see his equal. To Worcester's great good fortune, we have his equal in Michael V. O'Brien. The theme of his administration, 4 years old this month, has been to preserve and enhance the quality of life in Worcester through the development of partnerships. City Manager O'Brien, welcome. Our third guest speaker is Natalie Lashmet. She became the town administrator for the town of Grafton in April 2006, after 7 years as town administrator in the town of Boxborough. Prior to that, Natalie was a city councilor for the city of Marlborough for 8 years, including election as a city council president during part of her tenure. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Economics and International Relations from American University and a Master's in Business Administration from George Mason University. She has credentialed manager status from the International City County Management Association. Natalie, welcome. With that, I'll ask the Secretary to step forward and speak to us.
Thanks so much, Brian, and welcome. I'd really like to thank the Research Bureau for inviting me today. Last year, I was supposed to be here for this meeting, and they put our Ways and Means hearing on our budget on the very same day, so I was sorry to disappoint you in my first budget foray, but 1 year later, here I am, and happy to be out of the State House for a couple of hours. I'm actually going to say very little about gaming, despite the topic of your, the headline for your proposal, your program today. Why is that? Because though much has been made of the governor's proposal for destination resort casinos, he himself is very clear that the gaming proposal represents only a very small part of his policy outlook, a very small part, although an important one, of his economic development plan for the Commonwealth. There are a lot of other parts of it, life sciences and better education and many other things that he believes are the way to go for the Commonwealth's future. And so I'm going to resist the temptation to pepper my conversation with gaming references. I will tell you about the small ways in which the governor has proposed to use gaming revenues in fiscal '09, however. So I'm the A&F secretary, which makes me probably the gloomiest person on Beacon Hill, and people point that out all the time. So hopefully I won't make you too gloomy today, but I am going to share with you the challenges that my team and I faced in crafting a fiscal '09 budget proposal that meets the vision of the Governor Patrick and Lieutenant Governor Murray. So we'll talk a little bit today about budget challenges, the budget solutions that we used, and some targeted investments that we were able to fit in what was a very challenging budget. And I also just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about aspects of the governor's program of partnership with cities and towns that goes outside of the budget. So, to the challenges. You know, a lot of this is going to sound familiar to the folks who do budgeting in communities, Worcester and other communities represented here. First of all, the Commonwealth has a structural deficit in our budget. It's a large one. As we looked ahead to fiscal '09, this is something we inherited. As we looked ahead to '09, my team and I found that in the scale of a $27 billion budget, we had about a $1.3 billion net structural deficit to deal with. How does that come about? Well, first of all, in the fiscal '08 budget, there's $784 million of non-recurring revenues supporting recurring spending. And the legislature ultimately passed a budget last year with $604 million of one-timers, rainy day funds, and health security trust funds, that's tobacco settlement funds, balancing the budget, as well as $180 million of fiscal '07 surplus used to balance the '08 budget. So before you even do anything, you've got a, almost $800 million hole to fill in balancing the budget. How much of that could we count on to be supported with recurring revenues? The question is, not a huge portion of that. In fiscal '08, we are doing fairly well still for a state. We have not seen a revenue downturn. We are projecting that we will have about $400 million additional dollars over benchmark by the end of the year. It's more than spent. We've got a lot of exposures for '08, largely related to healthcare and healthcare reform in the Commonwealth. As an aside, I chair the Connector Board, which is the board that governs the new authority set up to manage healthcare reform in the Commonwealth. It's a huge challenge, and it's something that you'll hear a lot more about in the coming months as we wrestle with how to fund that program going forward. Great success in enrollments, but very challenging from a financial standpoint. So we have a consensus revenue estimate that brings $20.9 billion forward as a projection for '09. We do not know how '08 is going to end up, and we've done our best job projecting growth for next year. That's about 3.8% growth over fiscal '08. And does not deliver enough to cover even all of those non-recurring, to cover the spending supported with non-recurring revenues, such as rainy day fund. And what are some of the financial challenges on the spending side? Like the cities and towns represented in the room, we have some non-discretionary costs that we have to cover. Medicaid is 31% of the state budget, and it's expected to grow by $585 million in the coming year. There are a handful of other big cost drivers in the Commonwealth that took up significant new room in '09 as we projected ahead. Chapter 70 to cities and towns at $223 million to fully fund it in '09 is the second biggest increase after Medicaid, Mass Health, in the budget, and we did propose to fully fund Chapter 70. The Commonwealth also, as cities and towns do, has pension obligations, a required stabilization fund deposit, money that comes off the top for the school building authority, which is sharing in the cost of building local schools. The share of the sales tax that goes to the MBTA comes off the top. Group Insurance Commission, which provides health insurance for state employees, has a big cost increase. Lots of caseloads in the human services world are going up. I think it's sort of a harbinger of the economic times that we're in with the foreclosures and what have you. We're seeing more people present themselves for public assistance of different types. And Rosie D. settlement, one case, and there are many, of particular groups of people with disabilities, mental health problems in the Commonwealth, getting services enhanced through class action lawsuits, which cost, typically to settle these, you end up increasing the cost of service delivery to those populations in the tens of millions of dollars at a whack. So all of these expenditures together are growing at a rate that far exceeds our baseline revenue projection of the 3.8%, leading to, not surprisingly, this picture, which shows on the right-hand side about $2 billion of additional budget sort of pressure that we had to cover with, on the left-hand side, only about 700 and some odd million dollars in predictable new revenues for a $1.3 billion state budget gap. And we have a balanced budget requirement, so we had to close it in our proposal that we filed on January 23rd. So how do we do that? First of all, let me say it's a balanced, fiscally responsible approach to closing it. We emphasize, as I think is always appropriate, and the governor agrees, emphasizing savings and reform first. We also put in a number of responsible proposals to generate additional revenues. And we were still able to make certain targeted investments that the governor feels, and lieutenant governor feels, are needed to promote economic growth and opportunity in the Commonwealth. Because after all, it's only through economic growth that we're going to make the pie bigger and be able to deal more responsibly with the needs of the Commonwealth. This year-to-year patch it together, which you're about to hear me describe how we did it for this year, is for the birds. This is not a satisfying way to budget at the Commonwealth level, or I'm sure at the city and town level. And these targeted investments are things where the governor is fond of saying the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of taking action. In our budget, we held overall spending growth in line with revenue growth. Our authorized spending level is $28.165 billion. That's an increase of 5.1% over 08 budget and 3.5% over 08 estimated spending. We made a proposal to bring the remaining county sheriffs. There are 7 left in the eastern part of the state and out on the islands that are still county sheriffs as part of active counties here in Worcester and in the west. As you know, about 10 years ago, county government was eliminated and the sheriffs were brought into the state budget. This is a proposal to do the same with the remaining county sheriffs. And if you adjust for that, our budget growth year over year is actually less. Revenues are projected to grow by 5.2%, again, 3.8% through the consensus revenue process that already took place with the legislature, and the remainder through some responsible enhancements that we have made, which I'll describe in a moment. And this spending increase is below the 16-year historical average. Again, we're looking to what can be sustained. This is just a picture that I'm not going to dwell on, except to say, look at the share of Medicaid, 31% of the budget. If you look at the whole right-hand side of this graph, this pie, you will see that Health and Human Services spending is conservatively a little bit more than half of the entire state budget. If you consider that education aid and direct local aid represent another 21% of spending at the state level, you can easily see that everything besides local aid and health care and human services is relegated to a very small share of the state budget. I'll make this point really quickly. The state budget really isn't $27 billion. It's really more like $33 billion. We have a lot of things that happen, quote unquote, off budget. The numbers are increasing because they include things like pensions, school building authority, and increasingly the cost of Commonwealth care, the free care pool, and the other aspects of health care reform. This is a little known fact, but we're going to see these off-budget transfers grow a lot. We've been a lot more transparent in our budget presentation about the fact that these pressures exist. So how do we do this? Savings and reforms were first, as I said. We restrained spending through a variety of initiatives that resulted in gross reductions of almost $500 million, netting to $344 million, or about 2% of state spending. The net piece is because a lot of these savings happen in the Medicaid world, and since we get federal reimbursement, a little bit less than 50 cents on the dollar, that's kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, so you lose some for every dollar that you save. Key themes, we didn't just cut across the board. We made careful choices and sort of emphasized shared sacrifice. Specifically, we eliminated a number of legislative earmarks. As you know, the legislature likes to add to the budget with pet projects. The governor eliminated all the earmarks last year. We were a little bit more measured this year in reflection of the fact that a lot of them came back last time, so we were more choosy. We've increased the contribution by state employees, proposed to increase the contribution to group insurance, so the premiums, the contribution of employees will be tiered based on salary, saving $51 million. We've constrained growth in about 200 agency line items out of just short of 800 to 0% growth, which will cause some fiscal pressure in a great number of state programs. As I mentioned, in the Medicaid realm, we are proposing a number of savings through sort of value-based purchasing principles, efficient drug utilization, administrative savings, and the like. To get to the bottom of the page here, the enhancements to revenues that we proposed include $166 million in additional enforcement, enhanced enforcement and collection efforts by the Department of Revenue, better enforcement of the existing tax laws. We are proposing to close 4 corporate loopholes that have been studied by a commission since our budget recommendation last year. The 2 big ones here are combined reporting and check the box, which would modernize Massachusetts corporate excise structure to look like virtually every other state in the nation. We're a bit behind on that. And while these proposals would lead to about $500 million in new revenue on an annual basis, we've taken $297 million for this budget because it represents a partial year. And in a companion piece, the governor's proposed a reduction in the corporate excise that over time would give, over about 3 years of being phased in, would give back more than $200 million of that increase to corporations, largely in-state, smaller companies, where the loopholes would affect predominantly out-of-state, multi-entity corporations. We have proposed to use $124 million of casino license fees in the budget to balance out the $935 million that communities have been expecting in lottery aid, filling a gap between that and what the lottery has actually been bringing in the last couple of years, which is more like $811 million. This is the only use of casino revenues in the governor's budget. It's a measured use. We believe it's eminently doable should the destination resort casino bill pass the legislature, and it was done out of partnership with cities and towns. While this is the only thing inside the budget, we were clear that should we be able to get passage of the bill and receive the license fees that are expected, we would split the remainder of $300 million expected to be able to be received on account of fiscal '09 in 2 ways. $88 million of it would deliver direct property tax relief to some 400,000 households in the Commonwealth through a sort of expanded circuit breaker based on the percentage of income paid in property taxes. And the other $88 million would be distributed to communities through the Chapter 90 formula to address local transportation and other infrastructure-related needs. So $176 million outside of the budget that could really go to address local issues. Finally, we were not able to wean ourselves out of using the stabilization fund. I would have liked to be able to do that, but the reliance on one-timers in the budget has been built up over time. We did introduce a new policy for judicious use of stabilization fund just to bring spending up, to support spending at the average increase over the last 5 years. And that led to $369 million being taken in this budget, significantly less than the amount of one-timers that you earlier saw that 08 is based on. And we're proposing to redefine the deposit that's required into the stabilization fund to be able to include the interest that's earned in the fund. The Massachusetts Rainy Day Fund is about $2.3 billion right now. That's a healthy level, but could be used up in a heartbeat should we experience an actual downturn in revenues. As I mentioned, the governor proposed a number of targeted investments. A lot of these are in the education realm, such things as extended day, bringing Chapter 70 to unprecedented levels, significant increase in pre-kindergarten spending, increased expansion for kindergarten expansion grants, and so on. Number of public safety increases, including a $4 million more for the popular Shannon grants that deal with sort of anti-violence in some of the more gang-prone areas, bringing that into the budget for the first time. Lots of other spending on municipal police grants, youth violence prevention, and the like. Additionally, we have a proposal, should we be lucky enough to receive surplus revenues at the end of the year, at the end of '08, and that's going to be challenging because we've got a lot of demands on the '08 funding. A number of targeted investments to grow the economy, including life sciences investment funds, clean energy, affordable housing, workforce competitiveness, cultural facilities, et cetera. And including at the bottom of the list here, something that I think is really important, some grant seed money for regionalization projects that I think we need to promote in the Commonwealth to help communities become more efficient. There are other targeted investments as well, somewhat over $100 million in the budget, so we had to oversolve for the gap that we had in order to be able to fund these. So how has this been received? The House so far has put out a blueprint that adopts many of the proposals that the governor made. Seems to be going in a similar direction on loopholes, has embraced the additional DOR collection and the GIC proposal. We haven't seen any of the details of this, so we're going to be watching carefully to see how they, on balance, propose to close the same gap that we were seeing and address what is even some more alarming news about healthcare reform costs than when we put our budget together. They voted a local aid resolution earlier this week. It sounds as though it's an increase over what the governor proposed. It is exactly the same as what the governor proposed. $223 million in Chapter 70, distributed the same way, level funding of additional assistance, and $935 million in lottery, consisting of $811 million that we actually expect to come from lottery proceeds, and another $124 million, called other, which they have not been specific about how to fund. I think it's probably clear that they are not proposing gaming revenues to fill that. We're interested to see where they will get the resources to do that without gaming. And so the devil will be in the details, of course, something to very much watch as we go. Our budget also funded an additional $2 million for something that's very popular to communities, which is the payment in lieu of tax program with regard to state-owned land, which benefits almost every community in the Commonwealth. Just a word about the Governor's Municipal Partnership Act. Last year, more than a year ago, the governor filed a bill with lots of tools in it, both on the revenue side and on the cost containment side, aimed at giving communities more tools to help themselves. As I think you can probably tell from this presentation, there's not a lot of capacity in the state budget as it exists right now, whereas frankly I see it coming for the next couple of years to be giving the kinds of boosts to local aid that many cities and towns are looking for. In recognition of that, and because he believes that communities should have more control of their own destiny, the governor's proposed local option hotel motel tax, local option meals taxes, to eliminate the exemption, historic exemption on poles and wires owned by telephone companies. That would lead to $78 million more for communities. A 2% meal tax would be $250 million more into municipal coffers, on and on. The legislature is very reluctant to give communities more tools to deal with your own situations. We think that's wrong. We think it's very short-sighted. We think communities ought to demand more flexibility, more autonomy, more control of your own destiny. And there are plenty of tools out there that, with a vote of the legislature, would help communities immediately. The ATB last week ruled that the historic exemption on poles and wires owned by telephone companies is incorrect. That is leading to a DOR interpretation that communities can start collecting those $78 million of revenues through the property tax, but they will have to be held sort of in a reserve pending an appeal by Verizon, which we are anticipating. But that's sort of good news, and it would implement one part of the Municipal Partnership Act. There are other parts of it that you should demand right now. You need those tools. You should have them. The legislature should not stand in the way. And the governor's looking for more ways to give communities additional tools as well. Relying on the state budget to provide lots more local aid and enough to grow cities and towns out of the pressures that they face is not a realistic short-term objective for any of us. I hate to say that. So I guess that's the gloom and doom part of my speech. At the same time, I hope you will see that we tried to deal with this challenge in a way that reflected the needs of communities as part of our balanced approach. I'm going to stop and take questions later.
Secretary Kerwin, thank you. Our next speaker will be City Manager Michael O'Brien.
Good morning. I want to thank the Research Bureau, Chairman Buckley, as well as Roberta for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. When I walked in, the first person I was lucky enough to be greeted by was Secretary Curran, so I asked, geez, how things are going? And her response was, great. And then she asked me, well, how's it going with you? And I said, great. And I walked away realizing that we're both blessed for the fact that we're not in sales. But it is indeed a pleasure to be here. The reality is the national and regional news can't help but wear at your psyche. The rain, the snow, the cold, the talks of recession, housing slumps, energy costs, cost of the pump, Elliot Spitzer. It can't help but get to you. But the Research Bureau, as intuitive as ever, as well as the cooperation with the Beechwood, has included a full open bar for this morning's event. To ease our troubled minds, much appreciated, Roberta, very thoughtful. My purpose here today is to prop all of you up with good news. The fact is that despite all these tough indicators, that here in the city, the present and future is very bright. Each time I presented, and as I present to the Research Bureau, I speak to the reality the city must lead in its push to adapt to a new and changing world. A reality of social Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest. We don't have a choice, that we're in a competition of our lives. Worcester is very unique, and I'm quite proud of it from all the major metros outside of Boston, whether it be our existing industry, our institutions, our amenities, our location, our attractions, our housing options, this level of civic engagement that we have, our infrastructure. We have an incredible base to which to build from. And quite frankly, others can only wish to have what we have. So we have to take stock of those positives. It's absolutely critical, and we have to move on. And we can't dwell on the failures of the decades ago. I just verified this. I wasn't even alive then. So we have to let it go. We must recognize that the fiscal issues at the federal and state level are real. And you hear it time and time and again, that someone else is going to make it better here. We just heard from Secretary Kerwin. Clearly, the state is not in a position to assist the city any more than it currently does in financial aid or otherwise. So these trends speak for themselves at all levels of government as we grapple with the economy, revenues and deficits, et cetera. We must understand that we are charged, we as a city are charged with carving out that positive future, and a term used by Teddy Roosevelt as rugged individualism. So let me update you on what this means. City government must continue to get its own fiscal house in order, operationally and functionally, and financially. I presented this to you and this approach to you over the course of 4 years. It's hard to imagine that I'm going into my 5th year. I thought I'd be dead by year 3. I presented many endeavors to all of you in this regard. The definition of insanity is to expect different results when you continue to do things the same old way. So I stand here to tell you that luckily, as of 8 a.m. at least, we are of sound mind. Reforms, reductions in new revenues have been and will continue to be the constant. Not change for the sake of change, but change for the better. So from that standpoint, how? Push for major reforms have taken place and will continue to take place in employee health care. It's one of our greatest cost centers, and it's skyrocketing as far as growth is concerned. And when we started this process, they said it could not be done. We've also implemented reductions in the total number of employees we have here in the city providing services, while concurrently introducing technology and efficiency to ensure we continue to provide the services our taxpayers and citizens expect. We've pushed to get out of the business that we should no longer be in the business of. We've realigned government and continue to realign government and reestablished accountability. We seek and continue to secure new revenues to support city services, implementing private sector models in many cases, using transparent financial processes. How important is that? And projections and budgets modeling over 5 years to guide decisions today that will affect tomorrow. Absolutely critical. And investing in infrastructure at unprecedented levels. while we've capped the amount we're spending annually on investments to limit our long-term indebtedness. And we've collectively raised economic development up to be the #1 issue. Expansion of the economy, expansion of our tax base, and we're making it happen. So I'll hit each one of these topics quickly, one by one, and relate those to fiscal year '09. Oh. Wrong key. Bear with me. First thing is healthcare reform, and one of our greatest cost centers, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, where city employees begin to pay more for their health care and drive to informed, consumer-driven decision-making. When we started this process 4 years ago, our employees were paying 10% of their health care costs. We are now at them paying 20% of their health care costs, with new employees paying 25% of their health care costs. We've cut out the middleman in prescription drugs management, which is saving the city annually $2 million. And a recent push that I have underway is to have our employees pay more for their co-pays relative to insurance. And once we lock in all of our employees, which includes collective bargaining, over the course of the next year to 2 years, the net savings, again on top of the savings to date, will result in some $3 million worth of savings overall from that prescription drug management process. The last 4 years, the savings to the taxpayer in avoided costs is well over $40 million for that alone. Within the next 2 years, we must be at, with all employees, 75-25, with the employee picking up 25% of their health care costs. There are no choices in this regard, and with the clear need to undertake collective bargaining, this is an uphill battle with our employee unions. The next item that we've taken on with much difficulty and has taken a lot of political capital as well as political courage, we've taken on the topic of retiree health care, requiring all to transition to Medicare or those that remain on conventional plans to be at 75-25. Savings and avoided costs for next year on top of the previously projected savings is approximately $5 million, and it grows thereafter, redirecting these invaluable tax dollars from outdated and expensive benefits to direct city services. This has avoided service reductions and also avoided the need to raise net new taxes while still providing a solid benefit and dramatically reducing our long-term other post-employment benefit liabilities, which total in the hundreds of millions. We've shifted the risk. This slide gives you a very good indication of what these reforms have meant. And within the next 2 weeks, I'll present that these collective efforts have resulted in dramatic savings, in some ways pleasantly surprising, in the millions. These are savings that benefit both the employee and the taxpayer. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that if we didn't implement these difficult reforms, painful reforms, we would have health insurance costs alone as part of our $500+ million budget that would have exceeded $91 million for next fiscal year if we didn't make these changes. Clearly difficult reforms, but well worth the endeavors. We've cut our city workforce down from some 278 employees while still maintaining the more with less mantra. Attrition is painful. It requires efficiencies and retooling, and the work is never done. Outdated union contracts needed to be updated to allow for changes. An example would be where the Commissioner of Public Works in Local 495, through that negotiation, reduced what used to be a catch basin cleaning crew from 3 people performing that service on an individual catch basin to 1. We've gone forward with a redeployment plan for our fire department, painful changes, reducing 21 companies down to 19, taking 472 authorized complement for the fire department to 406, and we're closing outdated stations, all while maintaining the services our citizens and taxpayers expect. For fiscal year '09, expect continued refinements in the area especially of first response, where we'll enhance services to our citizens, the safety of our men and women performing those services in uniform while containing costs. What else will we see on the horizon and what we've accomplished to date? The P word, privatization, a push to get the city out of the airport business altogether, saving Worcester taxpayers over $800,000 now in an operating deficit, having that airport be a thriving part of our overall transportation network, but maintained and managed by an organization skilled in that regard, Massport, and also owned by Massport. That must and will happen. Through the last year, we sought bulk energy purchases on the futures market versus static fixed bids, which we saved the city over $800,000 annually. We've privatized and will be privatizing workmen's compensation and expect to do so in our injured on duty management. Our ambulance contract with the University of Massachusetts, state-of-the-art emergency services provided by UMass, not by the city, not by our fire department. And in that contract, having reimbursements from UMass of over $1 million over the life of the contract to dispatch and also to take calls relative to an ambulance service. Fiscal year '09, what can we expect? More afoot. As we look at our parking garage business, parking meters, off-street lots, as well as intermodal hubs, and pulling the revenues out of those to support economic development, public works projects, and increasing our stabilization funds. Let the private sector do what the private sector does best. We've rolled out new ways of doing business and to stabilize our neighborhoods, which is so important, one of our most critical assets here in the community, to ensure our housing stock and housing options remain our greatest asset. I've realigned my table of organization for accountability from the city manager right down to the inspectors dealing with issues in our neighborhoods of housing stock. We're doing computer-based tracking through resolution of complaints with citizen access. Key to this is accountability up and down the line with customer service front and center. Fiscal year '09, we'll see expansion of that where we use our customer service center to deal with housing enforcement issues and housing enforcement calls, stabilizing and continuing to invest in our neighborhoods. Difficult choices over the last years, but we'll continue where we seek new revenues to pay for our services, where we've seen increases already in the pay-as-you-throw program, already heavily subsidized by all taxpayers, but we'll continue to see increases in the pay-as-you-throw program to buffer that subsidization and see those dollars diverted to general city services. It's still a bargain, and it's an issue of fairness and equity. The reality is, without this, we would have to seek either net new taxes and/or reductions in services. For fiscal year '09, look to other aspects of municipal government to generate revenues to support services. In particular, the Green Hill Municipal Golf Course and its revenue stream being used to support our parks overall. When it comes to investment in infrastructure, we must build what we can maintain. For fiscal year '09, one of the great debates will be our public pools. Built in the 1970s at a time prior to Prop 2.5. After that, upon completion, we walked away from the resource. Now, some 35 years later, the push will be to rebuild 9. We can't maintain the 9 we have. We haven't done it for 35 years. Again, a definition of insanity. We need to build what we can maintain and also be prepared to provide the resources to keep those up and operational over their useful life. Economic development, to expand the tax base, push for jobs. We have to do that with a grand plan, and we are. Again, to tribute to everybody here in this room and to this community, the new Hanover Theater will be opening tomorrow as a catalyst for our downtown. The Gateway project is taking off. In fiscal year '09, the City Square project will begin and will take place. There'll be new development in Washington Square, new pushes for developing small business in our neighborhoods, combining state, federal, and local sources and private dollars, and new sets of initiatives that will be driven from the grassroots, not from the legislature or others, but from the grassroots of our gateway cities, that we formed a coalition between the city of Worcester and Springfield and New Bedford and Fall River and Lawrence, where we'll drive that at the state and federal level with those initiatives to make the Commonwealth cities outside of Boston the only place to invest and where the genesis of the next century for the Commonwealth needs to take place. Jobs are key. We'll continue to look for improved ways to assist those here with business, to lure new business. Jobs define and sustain the community. Let history be our guide on that. Fiscal year '09, we're pushing on multiple fronts to create thousands of jobs, net new, good-paying jobs. From Pharmasphere in Southwestern Industrial Park to RNXI in Gateway, to TriCab in the Airport Industrial Park, to expansion of existing stakeholders, to new ventures from out of state and out of our country. All of that's absolutely critical to the future of our city and will be a push in '09. Investment in technology. For fiscal year '09, the city will facilitate the installation of a 20-mile fiber loop connecting all of our public buildings together with wireless towers, all privately built, maintained, and managed, that will be a 21st century information superhighway and a platform for our citizens, institutions, and businesses to take full advantage of the rapidly changing world of the information age. Tremendous economic development tool, and will allow for a new dawn in municipal services. Picture this: rather than have 8 staff circulating the city reading meters to generate water and other bills, we'll be able to, with a keystroke in an office, read every single meter in the city. That's efficiency and effectiveness, as well as creating opportunities for the future. It will also be a platform for competition for a digital television service, opening our market to the C word, competition, which is so important in our cable services. I want to credit David Moore, Tom Zadelis, and other members of my team that worked hard to make that take place. We're pushing Worcester in marketing like never before, from CEO to CEO, from Choose Worcester to Destination Worcester. Push, push, push to get our name in the marketplace and to create those opportunities. In fiscal year '09 will be the year of the commuter rail. We have to endeavor to complete this task, and as I made a note to myself, to take the hill and take no prisoners. And my efforts are complemented by so many folks that share the same sense of urgency and sharing a belief of the city that we need to strike now. All these projects that I've mentioned across the spectrum for our city have multiple community partners that will make these go from the drawing board to reality. From our elected officials that are here today, to our appointed officials, to our business community, our colleges, universities, our not-for-profits, and our civic organizations, we all must pull in the same direction. Government clearly is not going to do this alone. What government can do and will do, and what I've shown as examples, is make government more efficient, provide the services you'd expect and demand, rein in our cost, make us more business-friendly, and better position us in a competitive world. So for fiscal year '09, what will the drumbeat be? It won't change and shouldn't change. Just some quick points when we look at our slides, as referenced by Secretary Kerwin. The reality is, when we look at our revenue growth, historic 4% has now slowed to the better part of 2.5%. It's a great challenge. Revenue faxes that was mentioned, lottery aid is 18% of our budget for general municipal services, lottery aid from the state. It's level funded again at 18% of our budget, where our costs are growing at 5%. Education aid, the Commonwealth has been a tremendous supporter of education, will be increased by $6.5 million. Our property taxes, again, are going to be extremely challenged, especially with national and regional trends from the economy. We've adjusted our revenues as we should, from a high of $4.7 million for net new construction growth and new tax base expansion in fiscal year '06, down to $3.2 million for fiscal year '09, putting tremendous strain on our budget. We also have to increase our overlay accounts because of the foreclosure market, anticipating abatements that are going to be granted. And then local receipts, we've pretty much tapped our ability to increase fees. We did that in '08. Motor vehicle excise tax is beginning to trend positively due to improved collection efforts. And our trash removal program, our pay-as-you-throw program, we increased those fees last year. We committed to the community we wouldn't increase our fees again until next year, so we're limited on revenues there. And then overall, on local receipts, we only anticipate an increase of $250,000. This just gives you an idea of what we look at. A very limited field when we talk about where we generate our revenues from, so therefore reforms, reductions, and net new revenue are absolutely critical to our future. Preliminary budget overview speaks to about a $6.5 million problem as we speak. We've got a $3 million overage on snow removal through the creative work of our financial team. I expect to address approximately $2 million of that before year end. We'll be carrying over approximately $1 million to next year. So all told, a $6.5 million challenge we're working with now, and I expect that to be very difficult as we prepare our fiscal year '09 budget, again, with the themes of reforms, reductions, and net new revenues. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Things in Grafton, they're just great. We'll start off, I'm probably going to go through very quickly in some of the summaries. It has a lot of slides, but the devil's not in the details here. It's the overview on how we go through this, how we're all sharing in this struggle. We recently, in the town of Grafton, decided to do some more inclusive projections and tried to give people a heads up in advance on what was on the horizon, because the budget was literally ask for whatever you want. Therefore, when you got to now, when things are coming down to a crunch, it's exceptionally difficult. So, first of all, a little bit about Grafton. Population, 16,890 is the official number. Our median income has been rising, luckily. Average house value also, this is probably its peak for a few years. Average tax bill has been escalating with our spending habit. We use a single tax rate. I do not think there is any room to go to a split tax rate because 92% of our tax burden is residential. Gosh, do we need economic development, and we're working on it. You see our total value and our bond rating right now is quite good for a small community. We just floated a ban for some borrowing and did very well. It went rapidly, and we were highly complimented by the bonding agencies. We have been the top growing in number of students in the community for several years. Two, definitively, I can say it's probably been in the top 5 for probably the last 5 years. 22.83 square miles and 100 miles of very deteriorated roadway. Quite a bit is winding, quite a bit has stone walls, quite a bit doesn't have enough in the right-of-way to really make it a safe roadway, and we don't like lines down the middle of the street. We have 2 dams failing. I just got my report, and I don't know how I'm going to fund fixing one of those immediately that's considered grave danger. 2 rivers and several lakes, 5 schools, 9 municipal facilities. We have 3 old facilities rented out. Gosh darn, they pull at our heartstrings. They're gorgeous, they're antiques, but anybody want to rent one? Anybody want to buy one? Not find any takers. We just built a brand new police station. It's gorgeous. Local politics somehow, though, got in the way. When I interviewed for this job 2 short years ago, I said, "Oh, I see you're building a public safety facility." And the room went dead silent. I went, "Okay, I blew this interview." Turns out it's a police station. What happened? We are graced, and I believe it truly, with 82 call firefighters. What does this mean to our budget? $600,000 instead of $3.5 million for a full-time department. I wanted to sustain this model. It is doing well. It's not a full-service department in there. They do supply hazmat calls, but they don't do our EMT work. We have a private ambulance company, which is working well for the town. But it's a model we can't afford to change right now. And with the dynamics of drawing in staff, we have a difficulty, and we want to try and bring in new people. People are not as attracted to the call firefighter profession, we're finding. So we're going to change our wages a bit and see if we can sustain the model for a few more years. So we go to, what do we do in the budget? Our primary task is to figure out what's the appropriate mix of our core services, satisfy the many constituencies from the empty nesters, the retirees, the up-and-coming parents with preschoolers wanting local programs in our libraries and our recreation department, and the parents with students in the current K-8 or the vocational school. We have to understand the impacts of our decisions, which is obviously a lot of a subject for debate. Programs that we plan and invest in, we have to target certain things because we can't do all that we see on the horizon at once. We need to make a lot of capital investments. That is one thing that we have been falling short on. And we need to start planning for that huge wave of not just current health care, but future health care for our baby boomers getting ready to retire. We have approximately 10 teachers retiring every year from our school system. That is at least another $75,000 expenditure. So we have to make very informed choices. The more education about what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it, the better off the community is. So in November, we got together and said, let's do a revenue forecast. This is our second time doing this. And here's my little warning. As I said to everyone, they're uncertain. They're always wrong. They're sometimes wrong by a lot. A lot of factors we don't influence, and the greater you asked me to project, I was asked 3 years. Tell me what we're going to have in revenues in 3 years. I said, sure, things are great. So, our sources of revenue, I think everyone understands these. We're no different. We had projected an economic downturn. We likened it to 1990 because what we're seeing is subdivisions who are requiring that the planning board extend their timeline for building. We have 2 failed subdivisions that we will be probably holding the bag for some expenditures because even though we do hold some bonding back, it's never enough. And residents always expect you can come and fix the actual private part of that subdivision where we really don't have any bonding authority to protect against that. So we likened it to that situation and said, watch this crest, it's not going well. We projected flat state aid. Thank you, we got more. But we're one of the few. We got more in part because we still have a growing school population. It was Chapter 70 aid, where some communities are actually dropping in student aid. Lottery aid, we projected flat or 3% decrease. New growth decrease, as Mike said, is decreasing. Local receipts and new growth both. So these were our estimates. Guess what? They were wrong. Historic revenues, a very kind of sloppy spreadsheet or a graph, and it shows you the tax levy has varied to meet the decreasing or the wave that you see of state aid. What I can tell you is it's not predictable. Our local receipts have been trying to balance some of that. We always review our fees every year, but it's still not enough. And then there's some other category, and that's very volatile, so you don't even look at that. Here's our local receipts trend. This is about 1/3 of our budget. It's not looking good. We peaked in 2006. Here's our new growth trend. Those subdivisions just went off the books, but we do have 40Bs. We have 40B projects coming in. That is the one small revenue stream we may see. They are slowing, though. There's nothing being sold at this point, and several of them are really in the almost permitted or permitted and not marketing. As you're aware, these are factors we try and explain to those who come in saying, you know, where are you on the budget? Why can't you predict these things? And we try and demonstrate to them there's so many sources and so many things we try and project, but we're not perfect. We're really estimating. I have a great team that works on this. So we do our darndest at looking at the trends in the receipts, but we can't project that 4 subdivisions come into the planning board in the same month and say, grinding halt, can we have an extension? State aid is volatile, as we saw. Our local receipts is what we're relying on more and more, and also we're using free cash and stabilization at an increasing rate. As you can see, here's our free cash trend. We're using more of it. We're rolling less. It's the end of the budget. It's our leftover non-expended. In other words, the little cushion we used to have, we sort of planned with a cushion, we no longer have because we're having to spend it. And I don't think we're particularly crazy on our spending habits, so unfortunately we are having to spend and rolling over less. We said, here's what's going to hit us. We have health insurance increases, which we thought we had a handle on, but because of retirees, it's going to be slightly larger. Our retirement assessment with Worcester County is a very large increase this year we really weren't quite anticipating. Solid waste, it's a second or the first full year of a new contract with Wheelabrator. Our Blackstone Valley technical assessment, we really don't know until March. And our personnel wages are 60% of all of our total costs. In health insurance, where we look at containment, we are negotiating this year with all the unions. One of the nice things for us, though, is Grafton luckily stayed on the conservative side. They pay 68% for an individual plan and 72% for a family plan. So we're not doing badly. Unfortunately, we have a $5 copay. Budget pie, 1990. I'm really wanting you to look just at the blue and that kind of pinky color. It used to be 9% of our budget. In fiscal 09, it's going to be 19% of our budget. And we are low on our debt expenditures. That is a crazy dynamic in 18 years. Solvency, we're trying to plan for the long run. Cash solvency, well, we can do that. Budgetary solvency, we can probably do that this year. Long run solvency, we're not there. we have to start planning towards the leveling of the revenues, that recurring receipts are paying for our recurring expenditures, and we can't do that right now. Service level solvency, no, we're not there. And we'd like to get there, but we have a long way to go. Expecting a few lean years, our population growth is continuing, but it has slowed. Luckily, it's also the same with our schools. We did have 165 students, which is about 5% increase a year ago. This year is going to be cut back to maybe a 2.5% to 3% increase is our anticipation. Our capital needs in many towns face the same thing. The city faces the same thing. They're all backed up. Those were the areas we cut back on. The municipal center is a 50-year-old school building. The pipes are so corroded and rusted that probably monthly we have a pipe break. They've never been replaced. The air vents have never been cleaned, and I have radon and asbestos in the building. So we said, okay, let's go out and do our budget. Here's your directive. The departments were asked to create 0% and 2% budgets for expenses. We asked for step increases in there and leave the wages out separately so that we could negotiate them and not lead the unions to what we're really willing to pay. We expected solid waste increases to go up, so when the town budgets came in from the department heads, we really did meet that request. The exceptions were the benefits and insurance and solid waste. The school operating budget with the same mandate came in at 10.9% increase, and they don't have benefits on their side. So we go back and we say, after the directives, let's really check our revenues again. We checked, and we estimated, and we got state aid's first number from the governor, and we said, yay, there's $400,000 more, but we said, oh, boo, we lost $400,000. We lost them in local receipts because building permits stopped, one of our largest sources. Our motor vehicle slowed down substantially. I'm glad to hear it should pick up. We sure hope you're out there buying those cars with those great 0%. And also, since we have spent down our reserves and the interest rate dropped, we're going to be low on our revenue for receipts. So in the end, where we projected, and this is like magic, I don't think we can do it again, we hit right on, within $50 of our projection. But that was with slight changes. Summary of our budget, we're going up $2 million. Fixed cost increases before wages are $1 million. We know the wage increases are about $1 million. Our net new revenue, after we subtract everything out and figure out, is only $747,000. We're going to use $1 million out of our free cash, which is not yet certified. So I sure hope we have it. I do think we will. But in the next year, we're not rolling money back into free cash to use for next year's budget. A maximum proposal, $38 million. The increase, we have traditionally, except in, I think, 2003 and 2004, put something into the stabilization fund. This budget plan is zero in the stabilization fund. That's scary. Our stabilization fund is about $2.8 million right now, which is pretty good for a town with a budget, or a spending plan, I should say, about $42 million. But not putting any money in there and taking $1 million out for capital is making me nervous, and I'm probably going to cut the capital plan in the next 2 weeks. This year was a new one. In methodology, in explaining how the budget was set. I didn't sleep very well for quite some time because I knew this would cause a lot of palpitations. We are going into the budget process explaining actual net school spending, which is something that's not frequently seen. The schools project a budget. They tell you, here's our budget. They don't ever say, also, the town will support our budget with all these other dollars. In our town, it's about $3 million. This time I'm saying your budget is that money plus your allocated benefits and some liability. And we have a few other dribs and drabs that will bring that number up to about $3 million in support of schools. This number is reported by the schools at the end of the fiscal year and projected for the following one to the Department of Education. And so I said, we're starting there. We will really show your share of the budget to the public because that's not usually seen. If you pull out a DOR spreadsheet and you look at your budget and you compare it with percentages there, it's not really the same thing because the DOE with net school spending shows what you're really also spending in support. So what this did to the school department was put out there in front, no, really, you're not getting 21 million, you're getting 24 million. But nonetheless, we're going the wrong way in terms of school support. Municipal budget, about 31%. Once again, we did the same thing on the municipal side. We really allocated out so people could see where these expenditure plans are. The municipal budget nonetheless absorbed $500,000 almost of solid waste, and the remainder of the budget is debt and some small unallocated items. So, as I said, this was to more accurately project to the public where they're really spending their tax dollars. In addition to that budget, we have a tradition of a lot of outside spending articles that kind of drives me crazy. It's a lot of extra work. And DOR then has to throw these things back into the correct categories, and sometimes that gets messed up. But we put these annual recurring expenditures in our articles. They support sidewalks, they support our vocational technical school, they support unemployment, they support some minor road repairs and engineering fees. And then this year we have been invited in, because we're so growing in our school space issues, to a feasibility study with the MSBA. We are hoping to go to town meeting with a debt exclusion, trying to explain to the public why we should do this debt exclusion. We truly do have a space issue. Unfortunately for us, the program says pick a location. We have 2 buildings burgeoning at the seams. The middle school probably is the worst, but the superintendent highlighted the high school as a space needs difficulty. So it's causing our town a lot of angst on the article, because the article refers to just the high school. We don't believe necessarily that's all they'll look at, but we really need something that straddles more than one building, but the program was designed to pick one population difficulty. So we're hoping it's a little bit more inclusive, and I think it will be a tough sell at town meeting. Capital plan, 1 million more or less for our items. It's not a whole lot, and I'm probably going to pull those DPW trucks right off. That's about $300,000 to save money for next year, because I might need stabilization to operate. We've been banking our Chapter 90 funds for roads, but quite frankly, this is probably going to address 2 miles of road if we're lucky. And we have 100 miles of road to maintain, and most of it's old. Sewer, we have a sewer revolving fund, and they take care of their own, luckily. So we look at our future choices going down the road. We have 3 libraries. For a small town, that's a lot, but it's once again a motherhood, apple pie, my neighborhood library kind of issue. Shared services, boy, I'm glad to hear there might be some regional seed money. I have been advocating for some improvement in services. I particularly was working on regionalized dispatch. My gosh. My constituents in Grafton expect that television version of the dispatcher. EMD certification, they can talk you through your choking, they can talk you through a birth. I have trainees that may have 6 months of experience. They're not EMD certified. I have one person on staff. If I have a major crisis, who do we lean on for the next call? Well, it's going to take them 15 minutes at least to get in. We do have some great dedicated staff, and a couple long-termers, one who's 50 years with our dispatching department. I don't know how we'll replace her. But we can improve that service if we make it a profession instead of a small adjunct to our police department, if we share. But the problem is, I don't have time to manage that. I'm CFO, I'm HR, I'm the manager, I'm economic development. I don't have all these great department heads I was introduced to earlier today. And I can't plan the difficulties of a regional dispatch center, but I know that my taxpayers would get a better benefit. We're not going to save a lot, we'll save some, but I do know the improved service level will help. We look at fees every year. Targeted reductions, healthcare is one. We're looking at pay-as-you-throw for our solid waste. We don't have a very good recycling rate. Work on economic development and regional identity. This acronym MORE, Municipalities Organized for Regional Effectiveness, we sort of reinvigorated that, and I'm hoping different things can happen through that. Luckily, we've been able to do a couple of procurements, grace of the mayor and Michael, to work on some procurement with the economic power of the city of Worcester. We need school space. Our DPW facility is not very good. We need library space. Town has never passed a general operating override. They've done like 2 debt exclusions. We're going to try one this year. We're going to have to look at bonding our capital expenditures because we can't keep this up. And we're going to have to bond for roads and improvements. So, for that whirlwind tour, thank you very much for your attention. My pleasure being here, and best of luck through these times. Things are great.
It's an unusual day when a criminal defense lawyer sits on a panel and he has the rosiest outlook for the future. Having said that, we have a couple of minutes left, and the floor is open for questions, but only a few minutes, I believe.
Can I say one thing while you folks are thinking of your questions? I may be the one person who's leaving more optimistic than I came in. I think having heard from these two talented managers about the leadership going on in their communities, in partnership with the other, with the elected officials that are here, I think that speaks very well to the kind of creativity and innovation and self-direction that's going on in the two communities that we just heard about. And that's heartening to me because, these folks planned for worse local aid than they got, it sounds like. They weren't just waiting for the state to ride in and fix everything. They're taking matters into their own hands. And sometimes I hear from the local officials who are not doing those things. So these managers gave me actually a shot of encouragement and optimism today.
Thank you.
Please, yes, George?
Secretary Carolyn.
George, if you use the microphone for us, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm George French. Good to be here. Welcome, Secretary. Sort of pulling back and taking a satellite view of Massachusetts, you see that all these cities and towns have problems, and you've heard some of them here. But the cities seem to be in particularly dire straits. Schools have challenges educating this new demographic, immigrants from Brazil, from Ghana, from all over. And yet the legislature seems to look at the cities and towns as a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. Reimburse on a per capita, even though the cities are the economic education drivers that's going to make the difference in the future. How does the Patrick administration view this balance between cities and suburbs?
The Patrick administration, as I mentioned, stemming from the governor personally, lieutenant governor personally, are very committed to cities and towns, feel that an essential part of their administration is making sure that each of us in the cabinet and in our agencies thinks about partnership with communities in everything that we do. I think that's reflected in the Municipal Partnership Act that I described earlier. It's certainly reflected in the budget to the extent that we could. We do not believe there's one size fits all. Clearly, communities come to the table with very different situations, conditions, populations, location, economic advantages, challenges, what have you. We've heard about some of them today. The form of our response in focusing on giving communities a variety of tools on the cost containment side, on the revenue raising side, including looking at local option taxes, very much reflects that sense that there is not a one size fits all. Not every one of those cost containment options is going to work for every community. Not every local option tax, whether it's hotel, motel, local meals, what have you, is going to work for every community. But why not make them available to the communities for which they will work? That will just add to the strength of those communities. If that puts in relief some communities that can't be helped by those tools, then look for ways to help those communities. So I could not agree more. And we very much are working with communities of all types. Lieutenant Governor's had done a listening tour, chairs a municipal coordinating cabinet in which he hears frequently from municipal officials about what's challenging them. I've convened a roundtable of local officials in my office, and we talk about what they need. What are the challenges facing them, and how can state government address them one by one? There are categories of things that we can do. Some we are working on doing just by sort of administrative simplification and how the state relates to communities. Other things need legislation. And there, again, So far, we've met more resistance than we have met support, and I think that's something that we ought to keep pushing the envelope on, because why should communities not be given more of these tools? The challenges are real. We are doing the same three of us are all doing the same sort of patchwork budgeting because of the combination of spending pressures and revenue challenges that we all face. We need some more tools to be brought to the table. The governor's proposed a number of those, and we'd like to see them be enacted to address just the phenomenon that you're talking about.
Uh-oh, here comes the zinger.
I was wondering, you're talking about more tools, I was wondering if I might suggest another one that I think would help all communities. Clearly, I understand that it has to be approved by the legislature, but perhaps the administration can at least propose it. City Manager O'Brien talked about the P word, privatization, and there are a number of services that could be privatized. For example, custodians in public buildings, schools, and municipal buildings. And yet, if you try to privatize those, they come under the prevailing wage. So that when you look at that, you end up with a higher expense than the city is currently facing. So that law needs to be changed. If we don't have more money from the state, why does the prevailing wage need to apply there, when in fact the cities and towns could save a great deal if they were able to privatize services like that?
Obviously, a suggestion that will meet significant challenges politically from obvious sources, something that should be looked at. I mean, there's a lot about the fact that we all have public employee pressures and requirements embedded in our budgets that are causing a lot of the financial pressures that we're facing. Benefits, we've all talked about looking at health insurance, pensions, post-retirement health costs, which most communities have and the state are only beginning to look at. We've had, and I'm a lifelong public employee, I don't like it when some of the public employee unions have decided that I'm public enemy number one in Beacon Hill, because I think we need to talk about health insurance and changing the deal and looking at annual increases. And these things are driving huge percentages of our budget. I don't say this out of a sense that we ought to be stingy about providing good jobs and good benefits to public employees. Again, I've been one my whole life. My staff are public employees. I'm very proud of them. They're some of the best people I've ever worked with, and they're worth every dollar. But when you're in a situation where taxpayers are increasingly asked through the property tax in communities to fund benefits that they personally don't receive anything like, a defined benefit plan, healthcare paying 10 or 25%, that leads to sort of civil war in communities. Not to put too fine a point on it. That's why overrides fail a lot of times. So I think we have to look at all of the conditions of employment. Having said that, I will say the governor and lieutenant governor are very supportive of labor, organized labor. The legislature certainly hears from them a lot. So all of these things need to be addressed in a very measured way, and recognizing that there are interests on both sides. But I think we have to have that conversation, because particularly around health insurance, as we have all talked about today, that is a cost that is growing at, in some cases, 3 times the rate of inflation, the rate of growth in revenues, and that is not sustainable. Again, I say it's great to have good benefits, but if you can't sustain them, it's not it's not worth having. We've got to figure out a way to fit those in their appropriate place in the range of things that we have to pay for. And again, I mean no disrespect to the public employee unions who work hard and have had these arrangements over time, but in the current financial situation and as we look ahead, I think that has to be on the table as part of the conversation.
Okay, it is now 9:30 and time to close our program. Thank you, Secretary Kerwin. Thank you, City Manager O'Brien. Thank you, Town Administrator Lashmet. Thank you all for coming. Good morning.